Raymond Moody is the legend who originally coined the term near-death experience in his 1975 book, Life After Life. For over half a century, Raymond has been researching some of life's greatest mysteries, with his main focus being on near-death, shared death, and after-death experiences. Raymond has a PhD in philosophy, an MD, and has published a plethora of books. He's one of the all-time greats of parapsychological research, and through his work, maybe we can get a glimpse into the afterlife. As always, we've taken the time to create timestamps which can be found in the description below. So Raymond, to start us off, could you please tell me a little bit about your background, your interests, and about who you are?
Well, first of all, Ben, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thanks to all the folks watching and listening in.
Thank you, Raymond.
And when I was 7 years old, I had just like a major life shift. I mean, I was intrigued by astronomy, and I built a telescope at about age 7 or 8.
Wow.
And at the same time, my favorite authors were Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear, and somebody we know in America, but not so much in Britain, is Dr. Seuss, who's the great American nonsense writer. And so I was just really into nonsense and how, the amazing effect that it has on the mind. 'Twas brilliant the slithy toves, did Gyron Gimbalin say. And that is, as Alice pointed out, that's kind of mind-bending. And so looking through my telescope, I had this thought that I'm sure you had, Ben, and most of the people listening in probably did at some point. It's like I thought, well, what size is this thing we're in, right? And so your mind zips out to the wall. But then you say, well, just a minute, doesn't there have to be something on the other side of the wall? But then the only other option seems to be that it goes on forever and ever, and that doesn't make sense either. So about the age of 7 or 8, I realized that this world doesn't make sense, and that's okay. That nonsense is really a fascinating thing. So I wanted to be an astronomer and a comedian. Was the two things I wanted at age 7. Religion was, that's not for me. And my dad was kind of cynical about religion. 3 times in my life, I went to a Presbyterian church. My family dragged me when my dad was going through his midlife crisis, I guess. But then after 3 times, my dad realized, no, that's not for him either. So I'm not religious. I was into astronomy. And the idea of an afterlife to me was I thought it was a premise of a cartoon I honestly didn't realize anybody took it serious. So went to the University of Virginia at age 18, intent on becoming an astronomy major, but took a philosophy course because I was interested in philosophy. And wow, Plato, holy mackerel. Just reading in the first few pages of Plato's Republic, I was hooked for life. That was 60 years ago. I read Greek philosophy more than anything else, still. And so at the end of the Republic, it culminates in this amazing scene where this guy named is believed dead on the battlefield, and apparently dead. All the people are gathered around him at the funeral, but he sits up and tells, I got out of my body and went through this passageway into another world. And I was just flabbergasted because by then Plato was and still is my hero. And the idea that this guy took this notion of an afterlife seriously, it was like a wake-up call to me. So I asked Professor Hammond, tell me about this. And he said, these early Greek philosophers knew of these experiences where people had apparently died and revived. And he said there was 2 trains of thought about it. Plato and others looked at it and took it seriously and said, this is indicator of an afterlife. But Democritus, who came a little bit before and had figured out that contrary to this perception that we're having right now that this tabletop is solid, he said, no, it's made up of tiny little bits that are too small to see. So Democritus's analysis of these experiences was that this is just the subatomic, I mean, the atomic invisible activity. The body appears dead. He said there's no such thing as a moment of death. And these experiences are just the residual of the atomic processes still going on in the apparent deceased body. And see,
Yeah.
isn't it interesting? We're just still 2,300 years later. We're still on that same argument. Now we call it oxygen deprivation due to Lavoisier. But the point is, it's like still the same argument.
Yeah.
Whereas it is very well that it's quite common for bystanders at the bedside of the dying loved one who are not ill or injured will have the same experience.
Yeah.
So, what's going on? Now, anyway, I went on, I got my PhD in philosophy. I taught philosophy for 3 years. I'd always been interested in the mind too. So then I went to medical school. I was particularly interested in homicide. And I went to medical school to study psychiatry and homicide, and went into forensic psychiatry and worked at the like one of the institutions in the U.S. that's equivalent kind of to Broadmoor in the UK. And it was just a fascinating career. And throughout this, I've interviewed lots of people with near-death experiences. I got to be a comedian for a while, but it was really neat. I've been doing it since 1966, and people get more and more people. So by about 1966, it was getting to where I could have done it all the time, or
Yeah.
not 1976, 10 years later. And but then I was getting ready to go to my psychiatry residency, right? So you couldn't do both. But I got to be a comedian for a while, which is just the greatest thing. I just loved it. Laughter is so cool.
Was it stand up you were doing?
Uh, it's kind of Southern U.S. humor, like stories about my hometown. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I can imagine that being hilarious. You've got a way about you with the humor. I can tell that straight away.
Well, it's 78 was so neat, Ben. It's I'm really glad I did a year of geriatric psychiatry before I did forensic, or at the same time I was doing forensics. So I'm glad did that too, because now all those things that were so mysterious to me that my patients said when I was 30, now here at age 78, I see what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, aging is a phenomenal experience. It is.
Yeah, it's strange. The human condition. We have no choice. So the inevitable. Yeah. So tell me, in 1975, you published Life After Life, which of
Mhm.
course is incredibly famous now, and where you first coined the term near-death experience, of course.
Yeah.
So seeing as you're the man that first came up with that term, which kind of feels surreal to be talking to you, how did you first kind of come up with that? What was the first NDE that you came across? Yeah,
The
how did it all
first,
first enter your
yeah, the
world?
first one, of course, was Plato. I knew about this, but it never occurred to me that it might still be going on. That just didn't enter my mind. But
What
in
about yeah, personally?
1965, my third year of college, I heard about Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry there at UVA, who had had such an experience. And
Right.
so I listened to George talk about it. He talked to student groups often. And I was
Mhm.
just blown away. I mean, obviously, this guy, to this day, the finest human being I ever knew in my life. And he had just this amazing experience. So then, during my undergraduate and graduate years, I actually did hear of another guy. I talked to him. But then when I started teaching philosophy in 1969,
Mhm.
and I often taught the Phaedo, is the Plato's, you know, discourse about the afterlife. And it just happened, some of the students say, yeah, my grandma almost died, or when I was in this wreck. And then as word spread about it, my colleagues at the university, some of them had this, were asked, we have these institutions in the US called civic clubs. I don't know if they're over in Europe, but it's Ben Franklin sort of invented them here, but these businessmen in town get together once a week and all that. And, they're always desperate for a speaker. So the word got, this guy over at the university is talking about people who almost died. I was invited to these civic clubs. Inevitably, Bill, there's one or more people there. Then these were the movers and shakers at these towns, right? And so they said, yeah, Dr. Moody, I've never told anybody that happened to me. So that's how it got started. And so I wrote the book, and it was written in 1974, published a year later in 1975.
Yeah.
And I was anticipating, people often say, oh, Raymond, you were so courageous. You were just, I had a PhD in philosophy and was an MD. And they say, "Oh, you're just, you're so courageous to put this," and that's just baloney. I'm just courageous. I will say I'm a pretty good observer, and what I had observed was that in the mid '70s, any group of people you have of 100 people, you bring this up, and there's going to be 2 or 3 people. Yeah, that happened to me, right? So that I knew full well that it when this got out into my feeling of projection about what was going to happen was that I thought, well, it never occurred to me it would be of interest to the general public.
Mm-hmm.
I was aiming this for medical doctors and psychologists and all who might read it, and then would naturally ask around among their own patients. And I was sure that it's true. And that did happen. But what happened in addition that I hadn't anticipated, that it was like I graduated, the book was published in November of 75. And I graduated a couple of months later from medical school in January of 76.
Yeah.
And in February or March, my friend who had a shortwave radio heard me being called the eminent Dr. Moody on some European radio station. And well, the eminent Dr. Moody, well, why am I? They believe it because it's said by the eminent Dr. Moody, but I'm the eminent Dr. Moody because I said it. It was pretty weird stuff. Yeah, so
Yeah, it must have been
I was not
surreal.
surprised for that sensation it created. I really wasn't.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, it is fascinating research, and it
It
is
is. I mean,
captivating.
just absolutely fascinating.
Mm.
Just and people from every walk of life and come back totally transformed by this.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
What was the general consensus on NDEs and this kind of phenomena when you were putting the book out there? I mean, because now it's still not obviously fitting with the mainstream scientific paradigm, but it
Yeah.
is becoming a lot more talked about, a lot more accepted by scientists, by people. But yeah, what was it like back then when you released the book, and how has it changed now?
Well, like I said, I was just totally unprepared for it becoming a worldwide sensation. My thought about what the book would have, I remember wondering if it would sell out the first printing, which was 19,000 copies. And I just was totally taken aback.
Yeah.
And I think my sense of humor was probably the main thing that got me through that. But, I am, philosophy is something really deep in me. I just, I was a philosophy professor. I loved doing it. And I didn't leave being a philosophy professor because I didn't love doing it.
Mm-hmm.
I left philosophy, being a philosophy professor, because I wanted to understand about homicide. And I got to do that. At a very conservatively, I probably interviewed 300 people who kills people.
Wow.
But more likely, you lose track. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
but it's probably about 400 people I've talked with who committed these horrendous, horrible crimes you read about in the tabloids. And
What did you
but
learn from that? Like, did you find that in the end they're kind of just like everybody else, but with a very specific difference, or is there something that really separates them? Yeah, what were your
Well,
findings?
Ben,
Or
I really did learn a very interesting thing about it because I got into it because I was fascinated with the psychotic cases, like these paranoid schizophrenic people who do these gosh awful nameless things, and that is utterly fascinating. But several things. Number one, I was doing this in the deep South, and I am from the deep South. I speak Southern speak with a Southern accent. My uncle Fairley was well known in law enforcement in Georgia. He was the chief of police in this little town where they Fairley was chief of police there for 30 years. And when he retired, they had to hire 3 officers to take his place.
oh well,
And so then my brother, also very well known in law enforcement, I used to ride with them and all. And I was kind of raised in the law enforcement milieu. And,
yeah,
and then so even though generally speaking, law enforcement people aren't so much on psychiatrists, because the word spread that this forensic psychiatrist was, the brother of Randy and the uncle and the nephew of Fairley, I was okay. So I started going around the state to testify in these trials and, insanity things. And so in that process, the judges get to know you. Then it's like, for example, this judge I knew worked very well. I'd worked on an insanity case with him. We just struck a bond. So he in this little town he lived in, I'm not going to name it, but there was this guy who was the deacon of the Baptist church, right? 55 years old, the upstanding businessman in town, the guy who threw the football when he was 18 in that pass and still had the picture. The homicide detective told me his team was picture when he was 18 and the football and all. And so this guy, who's the pillar of the community, decides that his girlfriend is inconvenient and that he's hires his sociopath brother to do away with her. So the judge, knowing this guy, Raymond, maybe there's a screw loose. So he said, "Will you interview him and see what you think?" And so so that repeatedly happened. Judges would ask me to. It wasn't a case of insanity, but they just want, what is this? And so I found out, Ben, that actually the people who are in a allegedly sane state of mind who commit homicide are much more fascinated than the ones who do it because of delusions the communists are telling them to do so, or the aliens have been planted a bug in their mind, all those things. That's fascinating for sure, but the really fascinating ones are the guy. And what I found is when, first of all, homicide is so fascinating to me. And so I had to sort of listen to myself. Why am I interested in this? Right. Well, what I think is, number one, we've all thought about killing somebody. Right. Number two, it's dramatic.
yeah,
And number three, it's the cognitive aspect of it is every homicide is unique and every one of them conforms to one or more patterns. And that particular combination just makes it, for your mind, just loves that. Sometimes we'd see 15 people a day just brought in with these horrible things. And, it's just, and I laugh and I laugh at, people are going to think I'm crazy. But I was talking to this forensic pathologist lately, this recent, and she said, I hate to say, and, I guess feeling me out, knowing I'm a psychiatrist, she said, well, in my office, like, we laugh a lot. And I said, right on, we did too. I mean, what are you going to do? You can cry or you can laugh. And
exactly. Coping
especially these
mechanism.
people who commit homicide because, and it's like as soon as they start planning this, it's so funny, Ben. What they do is they go into a fictional mode of it's just like writing a novel or something in their head. And almost all of them that I dealt with, their first mistake came at the very beginning, which is, I'm smarter than the police. That's
Yeah.
all of them, because their experience has been the guy who stopped them at the, for going through the red light, right? Well, those are nice guys too, but they don't realize that if they kill somebody, they're going to be dealing with a very different kind of individual
Yeah.
that stopped them on the road. So, I mean, it's just fascinating. Homicide. It's
Yeah.
just amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it's one
Yeah,
of a number of fascinating topics that you've
yeah,
delved into. I mean, what a
yeah.
fascinating career you've had. I guess that brings me is a good, nice opening to my next question, which is going to be kind of looking back at your entire career and your life.
Mhm.
What would you say, or which parts of your research and findings do you consider to be the most profound now when you look back?
Oh yeah, well that's obvious. I don't know how much you're affiliated with the world of, I guess you are, the world of people interested in reincarnation and near death
Hmm.
experiences and this sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, what I've noticed, see, is that is a narrative driven kind of mode of being, Ben.
Hmm.
It's like what people are interested in is the stories, right? And
Yeah.
Plato observed it in the Phaedo. He said, because the notion of an afterlife is so obscure, really, in reality as it is, that, it just doesn't, to form a concept. Uh, he said there got to be some sort of story just to
Hmm.
get started talking. And they had the same stories we do. It's like Uncle Willis almost died and he got in his body, or we went to the Oracle of the Dead, this place where you could call up the dead with these by gazing into an optical depth and so on. And so he said, well, there's always got a story, but we got to be a story. But if you're looking at for rational proof of an afterlife, he said, even a bazillion stories isn't going to add up to proof of an afterlife. He said, you got to have some set of concepts to
Hmm.
get it started. And that's still the problem. See, it's like people want to hear the stories, but they don't want to think through the concepts. And so I am happy to say here, Ben, that by the way, I'm an Aristotle. I love Plato. I also love Aristotle. And Aristotle, said, exaggeration, hyperbole, that doesn't cut it. And I'm on board with him. I don't exaggerate. And so therefore, what I'm saying right now is I, Raymond Moody, do hereby claim that I have figured out a genuine, testable breakthrough in the rational investigation of life after death. I claim that.
Hmm.
And the where I got interested in this was not the way most people do. To me, it was the fascinating thing about the story about and the was that it's nonsense, right? Because this is a long story, but if you look at the philosophical criticisms, the great thinkers, Hume, A.J. Ayer, for example, who've written about this, um, they say that the real problem with the afterlife is that there is no concept there, that the words stir up feelings and images in our mind, but there's no clear concept that you can put to have a meaning on it. And
Hmm.
that is the reality. For most people, that's a horror because they say, well, then that means it's a dead end, right? But I say no. Right now, for example, the two most powerful physical theories ever invented, the general theory of relativity and the quantum theory. If you integrate the equations of those two systems, the outcome is unintelligible nonsense. That's the sticking problem. And so in science and in inquiry generally, nonsense is a placeholder. It doesn't mean it's the end of things. Go back, go in your mind to 1915 and be a very well informed and educated person of 1915. Okay, and listen to the following sentence. All four of Ethel's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born. In 1915, that's utter nonsense, right? It's unintelligible. Now, add the subsequent knowledge of the role of DNA and heredity, the fact of gene splicing, gene editing, and cloning, and you can put together in your mind an intelligible scenario, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, what was unintelligible in 1915 is intelligible today. It hasn't happened yet. Listen to this one, 1915. I watched a movie on my phone this morning.
Yeah.
2023, it's daily. And so you see, it's like what has most interested me, as I said at the very beginning, it's like since and I was a child, is nonsense or unintelligible things. And people think of unintelligibility as a dead end, but no way. You know, when I was a kid, I really watched clouds a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go back to antiquity, the clouds were the epitome of the unknowable, the ephemeral, the changeable, the whimsical, and unintelligible, right? And because of that psychological symbolism, clouds were just regarded as completely unknowable.
Yeah.
Right. And like you think of the cloud of unknowing, the thing from Britain, and the Aristophanes play, The Clouds. It's like the whole image is that it's nonsense, it's unintelligible. But then this guy, Luke Howard, who was a pharmacist, he's late 1700s to sometime in the 1800s. And Luke had been interested in weather since he was a kid, and on his trips back and forth to London, it's like looking out of the coach when it's, oh my God, there's different types of, like some of them are big and cottony and puffy, the cumulus, others are, and those four, he was in uh, scientific society, and he wrote a paper just describing the four types of clouds, and it created a sensation because anybody who just cared to go outside and look at the sky would see he was right,
Yeah.
right? So my point is we can do the same thing with nonsense. Listen to this. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. That's nonsense. But now listen to this. Holiness breeds the lipstick of perpetual purple spontaneity. That's nonsense too, but yet a different type, or this type. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this city. Or had thoroughly the if well zoom, how's this? Now I could go on and for day and all the different types of nonsense. There's it's not something cloudy and obscure, it's very structured. And as a matter of fact, paradox of paradoxes. Nonsense, where most people think of as kind of disordered and chaotic, is in fact more ordered than ordinary meaningful language. If you think of, most people think of, if this is the level of ordinary meaningful language, most people think of nonsense as something down here, something sublinguistic.
Yeah.
If you think through it, you realize it's to the contrary, that nonsense is up here. It's because all of the different types of nonsense have one structural phenomenon and form, one structural form in common. That is, that they respect some rules of language, but they break other rules of language so that the outcome is unintelligible. And what that means is that you can't just think about rules when you're thinking about nonsense. You can think about rules when you're thinking about ordinary meaningful language. But if you think about nonsense, you've got to think not just about the rules it follows, but also the rules it breaks. So it's a more now. Once we can fix this glitch as it is in our heads. It's like people don't have the right conception about nonsense, so it twists our thinking in certain areas. And but to make a long story short, once you get this fixed up in your mind, then if subsequently you happen to have a near-death experience, you will be able to get through the midst of the ineffability problem in a new whole way. I knew it would happen a long time, but it's already happened once, to my knowledge. This wonderful man who's a scientist and also a sculptor, but more than any of that, just a really wonderful human being. And he, some years ago, was in my seminar on unintelligibility, and then he was both a physicist and a sculptor, and he was in one of my seminars, and then he developed H1N1. He was in the hospital for 6 weeks, couldn't eat, lost his leg to gangrene, had 3 cardiac arrests near death. But there, he was describing all this to me, but in the midst of this, his voice changed. It's like energy. And he said, and Raymond, he said, while I was over there, he said, my mind went back to the nonsense seminar. And he said, I saw that what you're saying is true, but you can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account, is what he said. So we have now, how do we know that it's 4.3 light years out to Alpha Centauri? You can't send a homing pigeon out there with an odometer. So how did they do that? Well, by the late 1800s, see, they knew from the Newtonian mechanics that it's 186 million miles across the orbit of the Earth around the sun. So when the Earth was here, they measured the angle carefully. They waited exactly 6 months later till the Earth was on the opposite side and measured it again. Now, we have an equivalent method now with the near-death experiences. We already know how they look when they are viewed through the lens of Aristotelian logic, which is predicated on literal meaning and true or false. Mm-hmm. But we will now in the future, I think, have other accounts of near-death experiences that are viewed not just through that lens, but also through the lens of principles of how you think about unintelligibility. So that's kind of like parallax.
Yeah.
And so, but it's not going to fly with what I call the afterlife establishment. See, these folks are addicted to something that doesn't even make sense. It's like the parapsychologists, their test, right? Get that, for whether it's real from the afterlife or not, is whether the medium tells something he could not possibly have known about a person. And what I've asked them for so long, but they just get their eyes go blank. I say, well, isn't it a self-contradiction to say he knew something he couldn't possibly have known? But see, they just don't get it. They just don't get it. I learned as a psychiatrist that people are very bad at processing. We are set up to process what somebody can know about us. We're not set up to process what somebody cannot possibly know about us. See? And so it's easy. Like I was in psychiatry. I just loved emergency psychiatry. It's just what a fascinating place. And I used to just love it. And I would sit there with the patients in the middle of the night for as long as it took. Right. Yeah. And because I loved doing it. But this one night I went down there and there was already 11 patients. So I couldn't do my normal thing. So first patient, his mother and father were there. It's like in their 50s and they were worried to death. What's the problem? Oh, it's our son. He's 30 years old. What's the problem? Oh, he's just singing all this, stays up all night. We're so worried. They were just worried to death. I had 10 other patients. Normally, I would have just sat there and listened, but I had 10 other patients. So I had to. So I said, well, look, has he ever had a psychotic breakdown before? No. It's 30. Okay. Well, paranoid schizophrenia, that's a little early for that. 30 is late for schizophrenia, a little early for paranoid schizophrenia. Plus, it didn't sound paranoid. It sounded more like energetic. So I said, well, look, has been making lots of long distance phone calls? Yeah. Well, has he been spending a lot of money? Oh my God, yeah. Like last week he spent $5,000. Well, what about hypersexual? Oh, his poor girlfriend's like, well, yeah. Well, has he started wearing a lot of jewelry? Yeah. Well, what about a big hat? Is he wearing a big hat? Yeah. And when that last one, I was looking right into that woman's eyes, and I realized from her point of view, I was saying things about her son that I couldn't possibly have known. All right. So I was some kind of psychic to her. But you see, it's like we're not set up. When you have something wrong with your skin, you go to a dermatologist because you think the dermatologist knows about the skin. When you have something wrong with your nerves, you go to your neurologist because you think the neurologist knows something about nerves. The only people you go to for things they couldn't possibly have known are psychics and mediums. Now, what does that tell you? It tells me that the whole thing of parapsychology and psychical research, it's pseudoscience, but and that's just too bad because this question of life after death, it can be handled in a rational way.
Yeah. Let me ask you I think for the rest of my questions, I'll have to ask you if we can try and steam through them a little bit, because otherwise I won't be able to get to many of them. Because I could listen to you go for hours, but I know that we just won't be able to do it.
I got it. That's right. So you need one of those hooks, like works through the internet, cut me off.
Yeah. So first of all, if just briefly, if you could just mention about shared death experiences, and maybe just kind of give a quick example of a compelling shared death experience that you came across.
Yeah, it's all of these things that we know of as the near death experience, getting out of one's body, seeing a tunnel, seeing apparitions of the departed coming into the room. Seeing the room change in configuration. All of these things occur not just in the case of somebody who almost dies and is revived, but also very commonly among the bystanders. Bystanders who are not ill or injured say that as grandma died, I lifted out of my body and I accompanied her part way toward this light. Or people there say that they see apparitions of the dying person's dead relatives come into the room, and even a number of cases where the bystander empathically co-lived the dying life experience of the person who was passing away. So that's what a shared death experience is. It's similar or identical in content to what we call near-death experiences, except they occur not to somebody who is severely ill or injured, but rather to the bystanders who are around.
Could you mention just the name of, or like a case, a shared death experience case? Either you can kind of talk briefly about it, or you can just give us the kind of name so that people can maybe look into it themselves. But just one case that you think is worth looking into.
Well, if I'm names, I don't like to give the names of my people I talk to, but there is somewhere out in the open there. Oh my goodness, I cannot remember her name. There's a woman who recently wrote a book about her own profound shared death experience, which is they're often very similar. And Sharon
something.
Yeah,
that's all right. If it comes to you later, send me an email and I'll put it on the screen.
Prentice. Sharon Prentice.
Sharon Prentice. Okay, great. And if anybody wants to learn a little bit more about those shared death experiences, I talked a little bit with Bruce Grayson about it when I spoke to him, and it's a fascinating phenomenon.
What did Bruce say about it? I haven't heard.
He told me just a really interesting example of one with a lady that was in hospital, and or a man that was in hospital, a nurse that was
I know
tending to
that.
him. The red,
Yeah,
the red car. Yeah, yeah. So that
yeah,
was my first the first one I came across, and yeah, he thinks it's really compelling and
yeah,
fascinating, which it obviously is. But
yeah.
yeah, this question is from Dr. Gregory Shushan. I don't know if I think you're probably familiar with Gregory, but I'm not sure. He's a researcher into NDEs and the afterlife through history and across cultures and everything
Yes.
like that. Some really, really incredible work, actually. So he said, I'm generally curious how he might have evolved on cross-cultural NDEs since his early books. Even in Life After Life, he talked about the myth of in Plato and other parallels, then had a chapter on historical accounts in Reflections on Life After Life, but not many other scholars followed his lead. It took a long time for more historical and cross-cultural NDEs to even be discovered, and they still haven't been integrated much into near-death studies. How important does he think they are to the field, and what does he think we can learn from them?
Oh, I think it's absolutely important to the fascinating and
Yeah.
essential to this field. And thank you so much for doing it. And I'm looking forward to hearing about your work too more. And so I just have to plead ignorance. I've generally speaking, as I've traveled around the world, all the things I've heard are familiar, but I
Mm.
haven't, I've been to Japan and China and Russia, and it didn't seem any different there.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, my the swath of the world that I've covered is very slim. So, I mean, I'm just really fascinated what you're doing, and I think it's essential to further understanding what
Yeah.
we're into here.
Yeah, I agree. It's fascinating. And if you do want to hear a little bit more from Gregory, you could watch my conversation with him. I can send you the link afterwards.
Great.
We had a long one and we kind of went into some depth. It's like 2 hours 40 or something like that. But yeah, it was fascinating. So here's another question from somebody else. This is from a person called Jimi the Earthling. He's one of my patrons. He kind of supports the show here. So he says, Dr. Moody, in the mid-90s, I accidentally happened onto mirror gazing during a deep
Yeah.
psychedelic experience, which was profoundly transformative. As a student of the occult, many years later, I stumbled onto detailed instructions for performing the occult operation of mirror gazing, confirming this wasn't a delusion. Could you please elaborate on mirror gazing, particularly your experiences, and if you have knowledge of the occult history of the practice? Thank you for your time, Dr. Moody. And before he kind of gave me that question, I had never
Yeah.
come across this mirror gazing. And then, of course, I looked into it and
Yeah.
I realized that you're known for this as well as your work in NDEs and other areas. And I was fascinated. So, yeah, I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, yeah. And thank you for the question. And this is truly fascinating. And all of my friends know, people who know me around, they all know that I'm such a bore, really, because my interests are so narrowly focused. It's really has to do with Greek philosophy. And if you go back to the time of Plato, even and before, the average person in Greece, if they ask what is a philosopher, they would say that a philosopher is a person who probes into things up in the air, which was a code word for magical flight or out of body experiences, or probes into things down into the earth, which was the code word for the oracles of the dead, were these places they had for calling up spirits of the dead. And the average Greek person thought that that's what philosophers did. And some
Mm-hmm.
of it is accurate. There is such a great, in terms of the interlocutor here that you ask your question. A really great place to look for it is the title of the book is Greek and Roman Necromancy. It's Princeton University Press. It's 2001, and the author is Daniel Ogden, who's a classics professor in Britain,
Right.
and it's about these oracles of the dead were an essential part of the development of Western reason. And so I first read about the oracles of the dead I guess, in Aristophanes as an undergraduate, but then also in Herodotus. And so, what is to make a long story short, one of the things they did, there were various techniques, but one, you could take a big bronze cauldron, for example, highly polish it on the inside, fill it with water, and probably a layer of olive oil. And after preparation, where you talk about your dead loved one and so on, and down under the earth in this thing, you would gaze into this by torchlight, and you can actually see apparitions, lifelike speaking apparitions. It happens. So when I read about that and putting two together, I figured out what they were doing. So in 1990, I started doing it, and it's fairly simple to do. I know the history of it in Britain involves John Dee, 1527 to 1608, who was a consultant to Queen Elizabeth, and he found out about this by studying scrying mirrors that were brought from Mexico when the Spanish went down there, and he found out he could do this, and he wrote a whole big book about calling up spirits through the mirror. It periodically gets rediscovered throughout history.
Yeah.
The church is down on it, of course, but then it's just part of being a human being. So these things do reemerge.
Yeah. Wow. And you built your own psychomantium, you called it, didn't you?
Yeah.
With mirrors and you had experiences, right? You had profound experiences
I had
yourself.
experiences, but more importantly, it's like I have guided hundreds of people through this by now. It doesn't work for everyone. It works in about 60% of the cases on the first attempt. If you go into it more slowly, there's another way of doing it where it always works. But I mean, it's in the United States, people have no patience. It's just
the modern world. I think it's
so. This is something that is hard to put into practice in the ancient world. For example, you were at the Oracle of the Dead for a month, but nobody's gonna do that anymore.
It's so fascinating though. Just in a nutshell, when you did it, and in any one of your experiences with the psychomantium, like so you're looking into the mirror or the mirrors, and you're kind of gazing, and what are you doing with your state of mind, and then what do you notice? Do you see like a shape coming, and then it takes? How does that work exactly? Like just in a nutshell.
First and foremost here is preparation is very important. Now, sometimes I will take that back to this degree that sometimes it happens spontaneously. People who know nothing about this can just walk into their house one day and look in the mirror and see a vision. That happens spontaneously. But you can create the situation where it's more likely to happen by creating an environment in where the mirror is in a darkened room with candlelight or a dim light behind your chair and so on. But then the preparation is, tell me all about this person who died. What are some of your fondest memories? What are some of the difficulties in the relationship? An hour or so. Then you guide them into this thing. And many people do say these a very typical thing that happens is that the apparition, first of all, they're clouds and mist, just like Lewis Carroll pointed out through the Looking Glass. First, a sort of silvery mist, then the formed visions. Some people say they see the vision of their loved one in the mirror. Others people say that it forms in the mirror, but then comes out of the mirror into the room. Other people say that they feel their consciousness goes through the mirror and they meet their deceased loved one in some other realm of existence. And what's most phenomenal to me about I still am just reeling after 30 years of this is like I'm just astonished that people interpret it to be a real event. My initial subjects were my graduate students of psychology and my medical colleagues and psychological colleagues. And I was assuming, well, if they see a vision, they'll say, oh yeah, looked like my grandma, but was it real or was it? I don't know. But what people interpret it to be is a real event, and that's still astonishing to me.
Yeah. You had a near-death experience yourself, didn't you, in 1991? Is that accurate?
Well,
and if
I guess it was, and then I almost died, but I didn't have that full panoply of things that people see.
Did
My
you have any
mom,
kind of experience? Could you, yeah, just if you did, I'd be interested to hear what.
yeah, I did. It was like and as everybody knows, these are hard things to put into words, but
Yeah,
it was like the best way I can say is that I saw the separation of the realms. It was
right.
really interesting. It was like you see where this thing we're in is just like it's like you see, yeah, it's not the whole story. It's
But it was
fascinating.
a profound experience for you.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Although, I mean, I heard about it so long. And
yeah.
everything is a profound experience to me, Ben. I mean, this world that we're in, it just
That's a
doesn't
profound
make
thing to
any
say.
sense.
You're right. It's
It's
every
just
day is
fascinating.
confusing.
Every day is amazing. And
Yeah, I
and right here is like just like it's so bizarre in the United States with a psychotic man running for president. And
mm,
I think that the depth of Trump's psychopathology has not yet been realized because people are focused on the axis to the the character disorder, which means narcissistic personality disorder and sociopathic personality disorder and borderline personality disorder all mixed up in one, as they often are. But what everybody's missing is the paranoia. And I mean classical paranoia, the litigiousness, the delusions, the tendency for it to get worse with age. And so, this madman is
yeah.
holed up down in Florida and got all these Americans who don't seem to be able to focus their eyes right.
It's
We
like you
know
said.
he won. We know he won. We know he won. I mean, it's just so bizarre.
It is bizarre. There's yeah, as you said, everything seems to be bizarre, and it's so there's so much that it's like you couldn't write it, could you? It's strange.
No, no.
Um, I know you said every experience is profound experience. What would you say is the most profound experience you've had that challenges the mainstream scientific paradigm?
Well, I'm not so interested in the mainstream scientific paradox, Ben. And I think one of the problems in this whole area of research you and I are in is that people pay attention to that. It's like what these people are into is not science, it's scientism.
Yeah.
I taught philosophy. I taught epistemology when I was a philosophy professor and a theory of knowledge. And the first couple of days of class, I just asked the students, "What is knowledge?" And I mean, I could, if everybody will just sort of trust me for what I found, but I think it'd be the same thing you find if you did it. But it's like what people say in the United States, and I think kids in Britain too. Well, it's science. Knowledge is science. And that's kind of vague, but I just asked, won't tell me. And eventually they'd formulate it. Well, scientific method is the only rational means of establishing knowledge. And so that was what they found, and I would write that up on the board. Scientific method is the only rational means of establishing knowledge.
Mm.
And I would say, is that what you think? And they say, yeah, yeah. So I draw a rectangle around it. And I would say, well, how do you know that? Now, there's only two options. You can say, well, scientific method is the only rational means of establishing knowledge. And I know that by the scientific method. And that's reasoning in a circle. The fallacy of petitio principii. It's assuming what you set out to prove. Now, the other possibility is scientific method is the only rational means of establishing knowledge, and I know that by history or philosophy or literary theory or the law. And that is a self contradiction.
Yeah.
To say that scientific method is the only rational means of establishing knowledge, and I know that by history, is a self contradiction. See, so scientism is an incoherent doctrine. And it's many of the people who are into scientism don't really understand it very well. They just like the word science,
Yeah.
But what I say is, in 2023, the question of life after death is a philosophical question. It still is. It belongs in the domain of philosophy.
You've studied children, like blind children that have had NDEs, and blind people that have had NDEs, I should say. I guess not just children. What can we take from that, and what are the NDEs like? Are they kind of visual in the sense that, does it defy understanding? Is it like, how can they say they see these things when they've never had sight?
Ben, I give up on that one, and I have interviewed a number of people who were blind and who nonetheless had something that must have been something like a visual experience during their encounter. But more so, Ken Rank, who himself has visual problems, has written about this. But in terms of what to make of it, I mean, I don't know. But my ignorance comes in at a much earlier stage. See, it's like I've never been able to get through that insight I had when I was 7 or 8, that just a minute here, I can be sure that I'm conscious right now. But the only reason I don't know that I think, but that why many people think that there's an external world, is that the perceptions have regularities. But the regularity could be because of something else than physical world. Now, I love physics. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I love every new development is fascinating. But it's like, I've never been. I can't say that I believe that there is an independent physical world. It's because Berkeley was, when I read Berkeley in 1964, I figured that out when I was a kid, as many people have, that you can't be sure. So what I want to know is, I'm not in a hurry, because I know I'll never know much of anything. Yeah. But the little things I do pick up along the way are fascinating.
Yeah. I think it was Dean Radin that said to me something along the lines of, I'm at the stage in my career where I know quite a lot, but the amount left to know is essentially infinite. And I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah. I've never gotten to the point where I feel like I know a lot. It's like in the Greek thing, see, Xenophanes, who was the founder of epistemology, although the word wasn't coined till the 19th century, but it was Xenophanes who founded it. And he from the very beginning, he compared human knowledge to divine knowledge. And the idea is that we're beat from the beginning, really. Yeah. But that's okay, because it's fun to figure out those little things you can.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, is something I've been thinking about. So with NDEs, obviously we don't have any evidence that suggests everybody has them, but I was thinking, there are lots of factors that could make it difficult for people to recall them or to report them. So I would say that the numbers are likely a lot higher than we have officially. And I know we're a little bit kind of in speculation territory here, although in a way all of it is a little bit. But what do you think to the idea that everybody would have an NDE under the right conditions? Do you think that's realistic, or do you think it's just some people
I think the trick would be under the phrase "under the right conditions."
Yeah.
And, I think probably everybody would under the right conditions. Then it would be kind of a matter of defining what that is. Then a big question is, it's, Plato said that between here and there is an event boundary. And that's not his term, but it's a modern psychological term, the experience of an event boundary, which I have had, which you've had, which everybody's had. Mm-hmm. And that's the experience where you're sitting in your living room and you decide you want to fetch something in the kitchen, right? So you get up, you walk through the kitchen, and as soon as you walk into the kitchen, you forget what you came in there for, right? That's an event boundary. And Plato said that occurs when you're coming from there to here. And I think that it probably does. And so
Yeah.
that's what I would conjecture, that something like that. Because, you know, many people can handle it, but for many people, it would be a very, for I think especially people with very authoritarian or uptight personalities would find it very difficult to try to integrate this world with that world. It's
Yeah.
hard
Yeah.
for the
Yeah. Yeah.
people who remember their near death experience. Imagine somebody who's so rigid. So
Yeah.
I think it might be in a case of an event boundary, is what I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm thinking, when you said that, I'm thinking also people that have a very tough life here on Earth, or really struggle with it, if they were aware 100% without any doubt that there was, that other life there, then there could be, an enormous increase in suicides or anything
Well,
like
I
that.
wonder.
And
I wonder. I've thought about that, but I'm not sure because
yeah, I'm
actually
not
the
sure either
message
way,
from
but
people with near death experiences is to the contrary.
that's
That
that's
don't
true.
do
That's
it.
true.
You
That's
know, it's
true.
like a lot
Yeah.
of people say it's like coming walking out of the movie in the middle of the movie. It's like
Yeah.
what I've had, a couple of people who had near the suicide
I
attempts.
I guess maybe if they knew about the other side but didn't have that kind of knowing that comes from having an NDE, then maybe there'd be that. But anyway, yeah,
Well,
good
or just
counterpoint.
this is something I ask a lot of people. Ben, suppose that you were um, developed a terrible infection which required you to be isolated on a desert island
Hmm.
all by yourself for 10 years,
Right.
and that they could send you out there in a cargo plane that would contain all the food and water and medicine you would need for 10 years. And there
Hmm.
was a little extra space in the cargo hold where they could put a DVD player and, let's say, 10,000 DVDs. And my question to you is, would you choose all comedies?
I don't think I would, but yeah, I probably need to reflect on it a lot more if I was really in the situation. But yeah,
Well, but
that's good.
most people say no, yeah, no,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
And I would say, so would you choose some tragedies too? Sure, sure.
Yeah.
And I say, well, then when you were all alone on that island watching that tragedy, would you be crying? Well, sure, sure, because that's one of the experience of a tragedy. It's a matter of frameworks.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like things
That's
that
really thought
seem pretty
provoking.
terrible within this framework can actually have a whole different
Mm.
perspective from a different
Yeah.
framework. See?
That's a really thought provoking way of putting it. Yeah, thank you for that perspective. Let me just get through these last then question or two really quickly. I don't want to keep you, Raymond.
Oh, don't
Um,
listen. I'm having such a good time, Ben. Yes,
no, I'm glad to hear that.
yeah, yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. What do you believe? So I'll start off this one by saying that we probably are both in the same boat in the sense that the evidence for survival of consciousness is the bulk of the evidence, is the fact that there is a whole body of evidence. But if I was to say which individual aspect of that, e.g. NDEs or e.g. shared death experiences or children with past life memories, which individual element of the evidence for survival do you think is the most compelling?
Well, I don't want to sound evasive, but I think this is very important because I don't think it can be a question of evidence yet, because when the sentence "there is life after death" is a self-contradiction and doesn't make any sense,
Mm.
then that unintelligibility spreads to the word evidence itself. So if the phrase "there is life after death" is meaningless, then the phrase "evidence of life after death" is also meaningless. So you see, we just got to change the way our thinking. By
How
the
should I
way,
word that question? Yeah, sorry, go on.
um, I don't have any copies of my book called "Making Sense of Nonsense," but I lay that on, and I'm not trying to sell books because, to my detriment, I'm not commercial. I wish I was, but and I would send a copy to you, but it's called "Making Sense of Nonsense," and I lay all this out there that just by changing the way we think about unintelligibility, we can think of a whole new ways to approach the afterlife question that makes it actually workable. You
Yeah,
know.
That sounds fascinating. I will have to try and read that at some point. It sounds, and I'll make sure there's a link in the description for anybody that wants to
Yeah,
find
I'm
it
not even
themselves.
sure it's in print anymore. Is the trouble? But anyway, that's the book that sets it out. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Got you. Okay. And then I guess the last question I would ask you today, before I ask for kind of a few words, a brief message, is just in your kind of, from your perspective, in your opinion, based on all your years of research. But at the end of the day, I'm not asking for a scientific answer. I'm asking for your gut feeling. What happens when we die?
Well, I think that we're not quite able to comprehend or express it from this framework, that it will
Mm-hmm.
always be a surprise, and that people nonetheless, they do have a common pattern of try to describe how it is. So I think something like that will happen. And I am at the point where it's like I realize David Hume pointed out very well why you can't draw the logical conclusion that there's life after death. And A.J. Ayer even hardened it by saying, he said, it's possible in our language to talk about a man surviving complete change of personality. He said, but it's a self-contradiction to say that a man could survive the annihilation of his body. Like it's like Woody Allen said. He said, if you can survive death, you can survive just about anything.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
really serious when I say the first thing here is to get clear about our concepts. But so I know it's not a matter of logical inference, but where I am is I give up. I mean, I am a skeptic in the Pyrrhonian sense. I hate these people who don't even know what the word skeptic means and who say they are one. Well, read Pyrrho, and Pyrrho, the idea is the skeptical modality is to refrain from drawing a conclusion. That's what
Yeah.
it means.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they knew logic very well. Let's apply logic, but then in the end, let's withhold a conclusion because, number one, it expands the mind. It really does. But also because if everybody else is rushing in this way to get to the conclusion, but your technique is to avoid the conclusion, you see things on the sides that everybody else missed, like the role of unintelligibility, for example. But with
Yeah.
all that and not able to draw a conclusion and understanding why, I got to say, I give up. I give up. I mean, I've all my life been able to think myself out of almost any proposition, but I honestly can't think my way out of. Apparently, to my remain, it's and still very counterintuitive to me, but to my astonishment, I give up. There's an afterlife. That's what I think.
Yeah. 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 I would agree. I think it's fascinating, and I think, yeah, the way I can answer the question in the shortest possible way is what do I think happens after we die? Something. I think something happens.
Yeah, yeah.
And when I say we, in coming back to your kind of the nonsense theory and everything, when I say what happens after we die, we is the thing that I guess would need to be defined, right? Is it the body? Is it something else? Is it
Yes.
consciousness? What have you?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's really just incomprehensible. I asked Eben Alexander a few years ago.
I
I
spoke
said,
to him recently.
and Eben is a neurosurgeon and I asked Eben, I said, obviously time and space don't hack it, you know, on
Mm,
the other side. So what is the orienting? What are your orienting axes? And he said, love and knowledge. Yeah, that's
yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah. 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 Definitely. Look, this has been a pleasure today, Raymond. I've loved
Yeah,
talking to you.
me too.
Before I let you go, have you got a message or a few words for anybody that's been watching or listening? And I should mention as well that an extra pleasure on top of the pleasure, double pleasure, because this is going to be your last or one of your last Zoom interviews, I think.
Yeah, I'm just, my last computer had Thomas Edison's trademark on the side, and I just can't use these things. If they had a crank or something, maybe, so I do phone interviews, but these things are so hard to set up. So, but I want to say to the people listening in, thank you so much for doing so, and I'm just delighted to be with Ben. This has just been the greatest time, and I hope that the folks listening in have had a good time with it. And
Yeah.
I think that we are on the verge of really like real breakthroughs in the rational examination of the afterlife question.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
thank you all so much for this. It's great.
In no small part thanks to your work, Raymond. I know you're a very humble person, but yeah, a lot of credit goes to you, whether you want to accept it or not. You've inspired a generation of scientists.
Plato on that one, really. This going on.
Well, we could. Plato probably could pass it on back to somebody else if we want to play that game.
Yeah, I'm sure he did.
But again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Ben.
It's been really enjoyable, and I could listen to you go on for hours. But yeah.
This is great.
Appreciate you, Raymond.
Thanks.
Thank you to Raymond Moody for talking with me, and thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the interview and maybe even learned something new. If either of those is true, please consider subscribing and liking the episode. Please see the description for Raymond's links and others that might be relevant. And if you enjoy our channel, please consider making a small monthly donation via Patreon to enable us to keep making content. Thank you.